My name is Diana Whitfield. I'm 36 years old, and I own Silver Creek Ranch, 120 acres of pasture and horses that I once ran alone with blistered hands, and a marriage that was already dead long before my husband supposedly was. The morning everything changed, I was standing in the kitchen in my riding boots, my blonde hair still damp from the shower, watching Ethan walk our new stallion along the fence line outside. 6 weeks until our wedding. 6 weeks until I finally became someone's first choice, instead of someone's last resort. Then I opened an envelope with no return address, and handwriting I hadn't seen in 2 years. Marcus, my husband. The man buried in a closed casket after a car accident outside Lisbon, according to the police report his mother placed in my hands while I sobbed into her shoulder. Diana, I'm alive. I need you to understand why before you hear it from someone else. I read that sentence 4 times before my legs found the kitchen chair on their own. Alive. 2 years I had grieved him. 2 years I had woken at 4 in the morning to feed horses he never once helped me raise. Rebuilt a ranch he never once thanked me for saving. Wore black to a funeral for a man who was, according to this letter, very much breathing somewhere else. Building a second life while I built his family's crumbling business back from nothing. His mother Eleanor had arranged all of it. The fake death certificate, the empty casket. A story invented to protect Marcus from debts owed to men who did not accept apologies. And from a family, he wrote, he'd started quietly in another state, while I thought he was traveling for work. My ring finger burned under Ethan's diamond. Outside, Ethan glanced toward the house and smiled, unaware that everything we'd built together was about to collide with a dead man walking back into my life exactly when it had finally become worth living. I folded the letter with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Marcus wanted to talk. In person. This week. I had no idea yet that he wasn't planning to talk at all. He was planning to take back everything I'd spent 2 years building, and he wasn't planning to ask nicely. I met Marcus Whitfield when I was 24, waiting tables at a diner off Route 9 outside Bozeman, Montana, still saving tips in a coffee can to pay for veterinary technician classes I never finished. He walked in wearing a jacket that cost more than my monthly rent, ordered black coffee, and told me I had the kind of face that belonged somewhere better than a diner counter. I believed him. That was my first mistake, though it would take me 12 years to understand it as one. Marcus came from old ranching money, the Whitfield name meaning something in 3 counties. Though by the time I met him, the money had thinned considerably, and the ranching had mostly stopped. His father had died young. His mother, Eleanor, ran what remained of the family's affairs with a grip so tight it left marks on everyone around her, including her only son. We married 8 months after that first cup of coffee. I was 25, dazzled, certain I'd found a life bigger than the one I'd been raised into. My own parents had divorced when I was 12, my father disappearing into a different state and a different family so completely that I stopped expecting men to stay. Marcus, with his name and his land and his easy charm, felt like proof that maybe some men did. Silver Creek Ranch was already failing when we married. Eleanor called it a temporary setback. Marcus called it an inheritance he'd figure out eventually. I called it, within the first year, the thing that would either save our marriage or bury it, because from the very beginning, I was the one who ended up running it. Marcus traveled for work, some consulting arrangement with a firm in Denver that never seemed to have a fixed schedule or a fixed salary. He'd be gone 2 weeks, home 4 days. Gone again before I'd finished airing out his side of the closet. I filled the empty hours the only way I knew how, learning the ranch from the ground up because nobody else was going to. I taught myself hoof care from library books before the internet made everything easier. I negotiated with feed suppliers who assumed a young wife wouldn't know when she was being overcharged and made sure they learned otherwise. I fixed fencing with my own hands in weather that cracked my knuckles open because hiring proper help meant money we didn't have, and money we didn't have was somehow always my problem to solve, never his. Eleanor visited every few weeks, walking the property in shoes too expensive for mud, offering opinions instead of help. She'd watch me muck stalls in the same tone she used to critique restaurant service. never quite hiding her belief that I was a placeholder in her son's life rather than a permanent fixture in it. "Marcus needs someone steady," she told me once, in my second year of marriage, watching me untangle a length of barbed wire with hands already bleeding from the effort. "He's never been good at staying anywhere long. You understand that, don't you?" I told her I understood. I didn't. Not really. Not yet. The marriage cooled slowly, the way most things do when nobody's paying close enough attention to notice until it's already cold. Marcus came home less. When he did come home, he found fault easily and praise rarely. The ranch's slow recovery, my recovery of it, barely registered with him beyond a passing comment about how the place finally looked less embarrassing. I stopped waiting for him to notice anything around year 6. I threw myself into the horses instead, into the land, into the one part of my life that gave something back for what I put into it. A horse, unlike Marcus, actually responded to care. By year 10, we weren't really married so much as cohabiting under a shared last name. Separate schedules, separate rooms most nights. A silence between us that had stopped feeling like tension and started feeling like the only honest thing left in the house. Then, 2 years before that letter arrived, Marcus told me he had a business trip to Portugal. Some deal involving a vineyard partnership Eleanor had connections to. He left on a Tuesday. I got the call on a Friday. Car accident outside Lisbon. Instant, they told me. No suffering. Eleanor flew out immediately to handle what she called the arrangements, and came back a week later with a sealed casket and a folder of paperwork I was too devastated to read closely. I grieved him. Whatever the marriage had become, whatever he'd failed to be, I had loved him once, honestly, completely. And some part of that love apparently outlived the marriage even after the marriage had quietly died on its own. I wore black for months. I kept his boots by the back door for almost a year before I could make myself move them, and I kept working the ranch, because grief doesn't feed horses, and it doesn't pay feed bills either. That was when Ethan started coming around. He showed up first as a client, boarding 2 horses at Silver Creek, while his own property outside town finished renovations. Ethan Marsh, 39, a businessman who'd made real money in commercial real estate, and somehow still knew how to muck a stall without being asked, which told me more about his character in one afternoon than Marcus had told me in 12 years. He rode early mornings, the same hours I fed and watered, and somewhere between polite conversation about weather and feed prices, something else began growing that neither of us named for months. Ethan noticed things Marcus never had. He noticed when the east fence line needed replacing before I mentioned it. And he noticed when I was too proud to ask for help fixing it myself. He noticed that the barn roof leaked over the tack room, and quietly had it repaired before I could argue about the cost. He noticed me in a way that felt almost disorienting after over a decade of being invisible in my own marriage. "You built something real here," he told me one morning, about 8 months after Marcus's funeral, both of us leaning against the fence watching the horses graze in early light. "Most people would have sold this place the second it got hard. Most people didn't grow up with nothing to go back to," I said. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered partnership instead, first as an investor helping me expand the boarding operation, then as something considerably more personal once enough months had passed that grief no longer felt like the only honest emotion I was allowed to have. Under Ethan's investment and genuine business sense, Silver Creek Ranch transformed in ways I'd never managed alone in 12 years of marriage to a Whitfield. He helped me hire a proper ranch manager, 2 full-time hands, a bookkeeper who actually understood agricultural tax law. Within 18 months, the boarding and training operation had tripled, and for the first time in my adult life, I woke up as the owner of something rather than the unpaid labor keeping it alive. I stopped mucking stalls myself around the 1-year mark of our partnership, not because I couldn't, but because Ethan insisted I'd earned the right to walk this land as its owner rather than its workhorse. "You spent 12 years proving you could survive anything," he said, the night he proposed, down by the same fence line where our friendship had first taken root. "I'd like to spend the rest of mine proving you don't have to anymore." I said yes with a certainty I'd never once felt saying it to Marcus. We planned a small wedding, right here on the ranch, 6 weeks out, close friends only, the same fence line as the backdrop, because it felt only right that the place where I'd rebuilt myself would be the place I began again. Eleanor had gone quiet in the 2 years since the funeral, our contact reduced to a card at Christmas and little else, which frankly I preferred. I assumed grief had simply worn our relationship down to nothing worth maintaining, the way it does with in-laws once the marriage connecting you is gone. I understood, holding that letter in my kitchen, why she'd disappeared so thoroughly. She hadn't been grieving at all. She'd been managing a cover-up 2 years long, and I was the only person in it who didn't know she was lying. The letter asked me to meet Marcus that Thursday, alone, at a diner outside town, the kind of place where nobody would recognize either of us. He wrote that he owed me an explanation. He wrote that things were complicated, that his debts had grown dangerous, that Eleanor had insisted the fake death was the only way to protect both of us, protect me. As if 2 years of grief I'd carried like a stone in my chest had been some kind of gift. I didn't tell Ethan that morning. I told myself I needed time to understand what I was dealing with before I brought him into it, though some smaller, more honest part of me knew I was terrified of what this would do to us, to the wedding, to the life we'd only just started building. I drove to that diner Thursday alone, my hands steady on the wheel in a way that surprised me, given how violently they'd shaken 3 days earlier. Marcus was already seated in a corner booth when I arrived, thinner than I remembered, older around the eyes, wearing clothes that looked borrowed rather than bought. He stood when he saw me, some old reflex of manners neither of us really believed in anymore. "Diana." His voice cracked slightly on my name. "You look—" "Don't," I said, sliding into the booth across from him. "You don't get to comment on how I look. You get to explain why I buried an empty casket." He told me everything in halting pieces over coffee neither of us drank. The debts were real, owed to men connected to the vineyard deal in Portugal that had gone catastrophically wrong, men who didn't accept missed payments as an option. Eleanor had panicked, arranged the fake accident through a contact who forged documents for exactly this kind of disappearance, and shipped Marcus quietly into hiding under a different name in Nevada. "There's something else," he said, staring at his coffee instead of me. "Something you need to know before you hear it somewhere worse." My stomach turned cold in a way that felt disturbingly familiar to 3 days earlier. "What?" "I have a daughter, 3 years old. Her mother thinks I'm a widower who travels for consulting work." He finally looked up. "I built a whole second life while you were burying an empty box for me, Diana. I know exactly how that sounds." I sat in that booth, 36 years old, staring at a man I'd married at 25, and felt something inside me that wasn't grief and wasn't even fully anger. It was closer to clarity, the specific kind that arrives only after you've spent years mistaking exhaustion for love. "Why are you telling me any of this?" I asked. "Why now?" Marcus's expression shifted then, something calculating sliding underneath the guilt, and I recognized it because I'd seen fragments of it throughout our entire marriage whenever he wanted something and needed me pliable to get it. "Because legally, Diana, we're still married. I never divorced you. You never divorced a dead man." He leaned forward slightly. "And that ranch, everything you and your new boyfriend built on it, that's still legally half mine." I understood, sitting in that booth with cold coffee between us, that the man across from me hadn't come back from the dead to apologize. He'd come back to take. The drive back to Silver Creek that afternoon felt longer than it had any right to be, 20 minutes stretched into something that gave me too much time to think, and not nearly enough time to arrive at any answers. Half of everything. Half of a ranch he'd never once helped me save. Half of a life he'd abandoned twice now, once through a lie and once through an actual choice to build a family with someone else. I didn't go home. I drove straight to the law office of Patricia Alvaro, a property attorney Ethan had used when he first invested in the ranch. Because if Marcus intended to fight this with paperwork, I needed my own paperwork first. Patricia listened to the entire story without interrupting once, her pen moving steadily across a legal pad, her expression unreadable in the particular way I imagine all good attorneys train themselves to master. "First," she said, when I finally finished, "I need you to understand something clearly. If your husband faked his death, that's not a private family matter. That's insurance fraud at minimum, and depending on what else is involved, potentially far more serious charges." He mentioned debts, dangerous men, a forged death certificate arranged through some contact of his mother's. Patricia set down her pen. "Do you have anything in writing? The letter he sent you?" I handed it over. She read it twice, photographed it for her files, then looked at me with the first real flicker of urgency I'd seen from her all afternoon. "Diana, this letter alone gives us grounds to reopen the fraudulent death certificate. But you need to think very carefully about something else. If Marcus is claiming marital property rights, and legally your divorce never happened because everyone believed him dead, that complicates your upcoming marriage significantly." "Bigamy," I said quietly, the word landing in the room like something physical. "If you marry Ethan while still legally married to Marcus, yes, that's exactly the exposure you'd be creating for yourself. We need to resolve the legal status of your first marriage before your wedding, not after." I left her office with a folder of instructions, an appointment for the following week, and a headache pressing behind my eyes that had nothing to do with the harsh afternoon light. I told Ethan everything that night, sitting across from him at the same kitchen table where I'd first read Marcus's letter 3 days earlier. I watched his jaw tighten progressively through every sentence, watched him set down his fork halfway through dinner and never pick it back up. "He wants half the ranch," I finished. "Says we're still legally married, so everything we built here counts as marital property." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his hands flat on the table like he was steadying himself against something. "And the daughter, the second life? 3 years old. He said her mother has no idea he's not actually a widower. So he's been running 2 frauds simultaneously," Ethan said, something cold entering his voice that I'd never heard from him before. "Faking his death to escape debt collectors, and faking a dead wife to build a second family." Something like that. Ethan reached across the table and took my hand, his grip steady in a way that reminded me exactly why I'd said yes to him without a moment's hesitation. "We're not losing this ranch to a man who let you bury an empty coffin, Diana. Whatever it takes." Patricia moved quickly once we retained her formally. Within a week, she'd filed a petition challenging the fraudulent death certificate, requested Marcus's actual current address and identification documents, and begun quietly working with a private investigator named Ray Delgado, a former insurance fraud examiner who specialized in exactly this kind of case. Ray's findings, when they came back 10 days later, painted a picture considerably darker than even Marcus had admitted to me over cold diner coffee. "The death certificate was arranged through a forger in Reno," Ray explained, spreading documents across Patricia's conference table. "Someone your mother-in-law has apparently used before, based on financial records I pulled. There's a payment trail, 3 transfers totaling almost $60,000. Moved through an LLC registered to Eleanor Whitfield 6 weeks before your husband's supposed accident." "She planned this," I said, "not just helped him hide. She planned it before he even left for Portugal." "That's what the timeline suggests," Ray confirmed. "I also found the actual debt he was running from. Not vineyard investors, though there was some truth buried in that story. Real money owed to a man named Victor Kessler, who runs what officially operates as a private lending business out of Denver and unofficially operates considerably less legally." Patricia looked up sharply. "How much debt are we talking about?" "Nearly $400,000, accumulated over about 3 years of bad investments and worse decisions. Kessler doesn't forgive debts. He collects them, one way or another, and faking a client's death is actually a fairly common way people try to escape men like him." I sat back in my chair, trying to absorb the sheer scale of what I'd unknowingly been married to for over a decade. Not just a man who didn't love me enough to stay present in our marriage, but a man capable of orchestrating an elaborate fraud rather than simply telling the truth and facing consequences like an adult. "There's one more thing," Ray added, sliding a final document across the table. "Marcus's current living situation. He's not just living quietly with this second family in Nevada. He's been using an alias, David Foster, and under that name, he's taken out additional loans against assumed identity. including one using forged documents claiming partial ownership of Silver Creek Ranch. My stomach dropped. He's already tried to borrow against my ranch? 6 months ago. The loan was denied once the lender's due diligence flagged inconsistencies in his identification, but the attempt is documented. It shows clear intent, Diana. He wasn't planning to quietly disappear forever. He always intended to come back for the ranch once it became valuable enough to be worth the risk. Patricia closed her folder with the particular finality of someone who just found exactly what she needed. This changes things considerably. We're not just fighting a property dispute anymore. We have documented fraud, forged identification, and evidence of premeditated intent to claim assets under false pretenses. I want to bring this to the district attorney's office alongside our civil filing. What about Eleanor? I asked. She's the one who arranged all of it. If Ray's financial trail holds up, and it looks solid, she's facing conspiracy charges alongside Marcus. Insurance fraud, forgery, potentially more depending on what else surfaces. I drove home that evening with Ethan beside me, both of us quiet for most of the ride, the weight of everything Ray had uncovered settling somewhere heavy in my chest. 12 years of marriage, and I'd never once known the man I married was capable of any of this. He's not just going to accept a lawsuit and disappear, Ethan said, as we turned onto the long gravel drive leading up to the ranch house. Men like this, cornered men, they don't go quietly. He was more right than either of us understood yet. 3 days later, I received a call from Marcus, his voice tighter than it had been in the diner, edges of panic bleeding through his usual composed charm. Diana, we need to talk. Not lawyers, just us. There's nothing left to say that Patricia can't say better. There's a lot left to say, he said, and something in his tone made the hair on my arm stand up. Kessler knows I'm back in the country. He knows about the ranch. If I don't get my share soon, Diana, this stops being a legal problem for both of us. Is that a threat? It's a warning, Marcus said. I need this resolved quietly and quickly. I'm coming out to the ranch Saturday. We're going to sort this out one way or another. He hung up before I could respond, leaving me standing in my kitchen with a phone gone silent in my hand and a feeling settling into my chest that Saturday was going to bring considerably more than a conversation. Saturday morning arrived gray and heavy, clouds sitting low over the ridge line, the way they do before a storm that hasn't decided yet how bad it wants to be. I woke before dawn, out of habit more than necessity, dressed, and walked out to the barn to feed the horses myself for the first time in almost a year, needing the familiar weight of the work to steady something restless in my chest. Ethan found me there an hour later, leaning against Bourbon's stall, watching the gelding eat like nothing in the world had changed. You didn't sleep, he said. Not a question. Neither did you. He'd called Patricia the night before, and she'd called Ray, and between the three of them they'd agreed on exactly one thing. Marcus showing up unannounced, after threatening that Kessler knew about the ranch, was not a conversation we should have alone. I called Grant Sorensen this morning, Ethan told me, watching my face carefully. Former state trooper, runs private security out of Bozeman now. He's sending 2 men out, just as a precaution. You think Marcus would actually bring danger onto my property? I think a man desperate enough to fake his own death and forge loan documents against your ranch isn't a man I'm willing to gamble your safety on, Ethan said. Patricia's filed for an emergency protective order, too. Should have it processed by Monday. Saturday, we just need to get through safely. I wanted to tell him he was overreacting. Some old stubborn part of me, 12 years trained to minimize every warning sign in a marriage that had taught me not to make a scene, wanted to insist everything would be fine. I didn't say it. I'd learned enough in the last 2 weeks not to trust that instinct anymore. Marcus arrived at 11, not alone. I watched from the kitchen window as an unfamiliar black SUV rolled up the gravel drive behind his rental car, 2 men stepping out of it before Marcus had even fully opened his own door. Neither of them looked like they belonged anywhere near a horse ranch. One wore a jacket too heavy for the mild afternoon, the kind of jacket that suggested something was tucked beneath it that had no business being on my property. Ethan's hand found my shoulder. "Stay behind me." Grant's security team, 2 former military men named Sorensen had vouched for personally, were already positioned discreetly near the barn and the tree line flanking the driveway, close enough to respond, far enough to avoid provoking anything unnecessarily. Marcus walked toward the porch with the kind of forced confidence I recognized from years of watching him negotiate with suppliers who could see straight through him. The 2 men flanked him, close enough to be intimidating, careful enough to stay technically off the porch itself. "Diana," Marcus's eyes flicked briefly to Ethan, then back to me. "I told you Saturday. I meant it." "You brought company," I said, keeping my voice steadier than my pulse currently allowed. "Insurance," Marcus said. "Kessler's men. They're here to make sure this conversation stays productive." The larger of the 2 men, jacket bulging slightly at his side, stepped half a pace forward. "Mr. Whitfield's told us all about this place. Real nice piece of property. Worth a lot more than what he's owed, probably. We're just here to make sure everyone remembers what's fair." "This is private property," Ethan said, his voice low and level in a way that carried more warning than any raised voice could have managed. "You need to leave." "We'll leave," the second man said, smiling in a way that held no warmth whatsoever. "Soon as Mrs. Whitfield here signs over what's rightfully her husband's." Marcus stepped closer to the porch steps. "Diana, please, just sign the transfer papers. Half the property, that's all Kessler's asking for. You keep the house, the horses, all of it, just half the land value, and this is over for both of us." "You faked your death," I said. "You let me bury an empty casket. You built a second family while I rebuilt this ranch from nothing. And now you're bringing armed men onto my property to threaten me into signing away what I built with someone who actually helped me." "It's not about what's fair, Diana," Marcus said, something desperate slipping through the calm he was trying to maintain. "It's about what happens to me if I go back to Kessler with nothing. You don't understand what these people do to men who don't pay." "That's not my problem," I said. "That was never supposed to be my problem. You made it my problem when you decided lying to me for 2 years was easier than telling me the truth." The larger man's hand moved toward his jacket, slow, deliberate, clearly meant as intimidation rather than immediate action, but my heart still slammed against my ribs at the sight of it. That was when gravel crunched loudly behind them, and 2 more vehicles pulled into the drive. Grant Sorensen's black truck followed immediately by a Bozeman County Sheriff's cruiser, lights flashing silently. Patricia had made one additional call that morning that she hadn't mentioned to me directly, a call to Detective Marlene Cho, who'd been quietly coordinating with Ray Delgado on the fraud investigation for the past week and had been waiting, it turned out, for exactly the kind of overt threat that would let her intervene decisively. Grant emerged from his truck first, flanked by 2 of his men, all 3 moving with the unhurried, controlled confidence of people who'd handled situations considerably worse than this one. The sheriff's deputy stepped out immediately after, hand resting near his belt, expression carefully neutral. "Afternoon," Grant said, addressing Marcus's 2 companions directly, ignoring Marcus entirely. "I'm going to need you both to step away from the porch." The larger man's hand froze halfway to his jacket. Whatever calculations were happening behind his eyes, weighing the wisdom of escalating in front of an armed deputy, resolved quickly in favor of caution. "We're leaving," he said, backing toward the SUV. "This isn't worth the trouble." Marcus stood alone on the gravel, watching his hired muscle retreat toward their vehicle, something like panic finally breaking through the calm facade he'd worn since stepping out of his car. "Marcus Whitfield," the deputy said, stepping forward with a folded document in hand. "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of insurance fraud, forgery, and conspiracy, filed jointly with the district attorney's office and federal postal inspectors given the interstate nature of the fraud." "This is a misunderstanding," Marcus said, his voice cracking in a way I'd never heard from him in 12 years of marriage. "Diana, tell them, this is just a family matter, a property dispute." "It stopped being a family matter the moment you brought armed men onto my property," I said. The deputy read him his rights, while Grant's men calmly confirmed the SUV had left the property without incident, the 2 hired men apparently unwilling to risk federal charges alongside Marcus's growing list of them. I watched them put my husband, my legal husband, in the back of a sheriff's cruiser and felt something inside me finally settle after 2 weeks of chaos. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter than that. Relief, maybe, the particular kind that arrives only after real danger has passed and left you still standing. Ethan's arm came around my shoulders the second the cruiser pulled away, and I let myself lean into him fully for the first time all day. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I will be," I said, and for the first time since that letter arrived in my kitchen, I actually believed it. Detective Cho stayed another hour, taking statements, confirming details Ray had already documented, explaining that Eleanor Whitfield would likely be arrested within days once financial records connecting her to the forged death certificate were formally presented to a grand jury. "You should know," Cho added before leaving, "Marcus's associate, the man he owes money to, Victor Kessler, is already under separate federal investigation for loan sharking and extortion. Sending men onto your property today just handed us additional evidence against him, too. Sometimes desperate men make our jobs considerably easier." Whatever fear Marcus had hoped to instill in me that morning had instead sealed his own fate more thoroughly than anything Patricia's careful legal filings could have managed alone. That night, Ethan and I sat on the porch steps long after the horses had settled, and the ranch had gone quiet again. The same gravel drive that had held armed strangers hours earlier now empty and unremarkable under a sky finally clearing of storm clouds. "I keep thinking about how close that could have gone differently," I said. "It didn't," Ethan said simply, "because we didn't face it alone. That's the whole difference between what you had with him and what we have." I leaned my head against his shoulder, watching the last of the daylight fade over the ridgeline, and understood, with a clarity that felt earned rather than given, that whatever came next in the legal process, I had already won the only thing that actually mattered. Eleanor Whitfield was arrested 11 days later, on a Tuesday morning, in the same tailored coat she used to wear walking my property in shoes too expensive for mud. Ray's financial trail had held up exactly as he'd promised, 3 wire transfers connecting her directly to the forger in Reno, alongside phone records placing her in contact with him 6 weeks before her son's supposed fatal accident. I didn't attend the arrest. I heard about it from Patricia, in her office, over coffee that had finally started tasting like something other than dread. "She's facing conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and obstruction," Patricia told me. "Given the financial trail, and given that she's shown no remorse whatsoever in her statements to investigators, the district attorney isn't inclined toward leniency." "What did she say? In her statements?" Patricia's expression flickered with something close to disbelief. "She told investigators she did what any mother would do to protect her son. She doesn't seem to understand that faking a death certificate isn't protection, Diana. It's a felony." I thought about 12 years of Eleanor's quiet criticism, her assumption that I was temporary furniture in her son's life, rather than the person actually holding that life together. I thought about 2 years of genuine grief I'd carried for a man who'd simply been hiding from consequences he'd created himself, protected by a mother who valued her son's comfort over my basic right to the truth. I didn't feel satisfaction watching her face those charges. I felt something more like exhaustion finally lifting, the particular relief of understanding that the years of feeling somehow inadequate in that family had never actually been about my inadequacy at all. Marcus's case moved faster than either lawyer expected, largely because the evidence against him was so thoroughly documented that his own attorney advised against fighting it in trial. Insurance fraud, forgery, attempted bigamy, given his relationship with the woman in Nevada he'd never actually divorced me to be with. Conspiracy charges tied directly to Eleanor's actions on his behalf. He pled guilty to reduce his sentence, 6 years with possibility of parole after 4, a number that felt both enormous and somehow insufficient given everything 2 years of stolen grief had actually cost me. The civil side resolved more cleanly than the criminal side. With Marcus's fraud thoroughly documented and his guilty plea entered, Patricia successfully argued that his death certificate fraud had effectively terminated any legitimate marital claim to property I'd built independently during the years he'd been legally absent. The court annulled our marriage entirely, retroactive to the date of his fraudulent death, rather than requiring the lengthy process of a traditional divorce. Silver Creek Ranch remained entirely mine. Every acre, every horse, every improvement Ethan and I had built together over 2 years, protected clearly under law from any claim Marcus or his mother might have attempted. The 3-year-old girl in Nevada, weighed on me more than either of the criminal proceedings did. Her mother, I learned through Ray's careful investigation, had genuinely believed herself Marcus's legitimate second wife after a small courthouse ceremony, entirely unaware she'd married a man still legally bound to someone else. She was, in every way that mattered, as much a victim of Marcus's deception as I had been. I reached out to her once, through an intermediary, not to cause her further pain, but simply to make sure she understood the truth clearly enough to protect herself and her daughter going forward. She never responded directly, and I didn't push for more than that single attempt. Some wounds heal better without an audience. Ethan and I married in early autumn, exactly as originally planned, though considerably later than our original 6-week timeline had allowed. The wedding took place right there at Silver Creek, the same fence line where he'd first proposed, where we'd first built something honest between us, before either of us fully understood what honesty in a partnership actually felt like. My mother flew in from Arizona, the first time she'd seen the ranch since I'd first married into it over a decade earlier. Grant Sorensen attended too, along with the 2 security men who'd stood quietly at my tree line that Saturday afternoon, men I'd never properly thanked beyond the check Ethan had written them, until that day when I pulled each of them aside individually and told them exactly what their presence had meant to me. "You didn't have to say anything," the older one told me, looking faintly embarrassed by the attention. "Just doing the job." "You kept me safe on my own property," I said. "That matters more than you're giving yourselves credit for." Ray Delgado came as well, along with Patricia, both of them having become, over the course of several intense weeks, something closer to friends than professional contacts. Detective Cho sent a card, unable to attend given an ongoing case, but wrote a note I kept long after the wedding itself had faded into memory. Some people build empires on other people's silence. You reminded a lot of people this year that silence has an expiration date. I stood at that fence line in a simple ivory dress, my blonde hair loose the way Ethan always said he preferred it, and married a man who had never once needed me to be smaller than I actually was. The ranch itself continued thriving in the months that followed. Our boarding operation expanded again, this time into a small training program for young riders, something I'd wanted to build for years, but never had the resources or the confidence to attempt during my marriage to Marcus. Ethan handled the business side with the same steady competence he brought to everything, while I focused on the horses and the land, finally working from love rather than desperate necessity. I think often about the difference between the 2 marriages, not to dwell in bitterness, but because understanding that difference clearly feels important, feels like something worth carrying forward rather than forgetting. Marcus had never once asked what I wanted from my own life. He'd simply assumed my labor, my loyalty, my presence, the way people assume weather, something that simply exists to be endured rather than appreciated. Ethan asked constantly what I wanted the ranch to become, what I wanted our life together to look like, what parts of my past I wanted to build from, and what parts I needed permission to finally set down. I didn't need his permission, not really. But having someone ask, after 12 years of nobody asking anything at all, felt like its own particular kind of healing. Eleanor received 4 years, eventually in a plea deal that acknowledged her diminished, but not absent culpability compared to her son's more extensive fraud. I heard, secondhand through mutual acquaintances in town, that she maintains even now that she did nothing wrong, that mothers protect their children by whatever means necessary, that the world simply failed to understand her devotion correctly. I've stopped needing her to understand anything. Some people spend their entire lives incapable of recognizing the harm they cause, and waiting for that recognition before allowing yourself peace is its own kind of prison. Marcus writes to me sometimes, from prison, letters I read once and then file away without responding. He apologizes in each one, though the apologies always circle back eventually to explanations, to justifications, to some version of the story where circumstances forced his hand rather than his own choices creating every circumstance that followed. I don't hate him anymore. I spent considerable time in therapy this past year making sure of that, the same kind of careful, unglamorous work that eventually let me understand my own worth wasn't measured by how much labor I could perform for people who never once asked what I needed in return. Silver Creek Ranch sits exactly where it always has, weathering another Montana winter, the horses settling into warm stalls each evening, while Ethan and I share dinner in the kitchen, where this entire story began, with an envelope that had no return address. Sometimes, walking the property at dusk, I think about the woman I was at 24, dazzled by a man's expensive jacket and a name that meant something in 3 counties, certain that proximity to someone else's inheritance was the same thing as building a life of my own. She wasn't wrong to want more than what she'd been raised into. She was only wrong about where that more would actually come from. It never came from Marcus's name or Eleanor's approval or 12 years of exhausting myself to earn love from people who'd already decided, long before I arrived, exactly how small they expected me to remain. It came from mud on my own hands and fences I rebuilt myself, and eventually from a man who rode up one morning simply to board 2 horses and stayed instead to help me discover I'd been building something worth having all along. I own this ranch now, fully, honestly, without a single debt owed to anyone who ever tried to make my worth conditional on my silence. Some mornings, watching the sun rise over pasture, I once thought I'd have to earn forever and never actually keep. I think that might be the truest ending any of this could have offered.
Thank you so much for watching. Drop a comment below, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.